There are towns in the Canadian West where a woman can become the quiet center of a place without ever asking for it. Not because she performs anything, not because she campaigns for attention, but because something in the way she moves through a room, some quality of steadiness, of warmth that doesn't ask to be noticed, makes the whole town arrange itself around her without quite realizing it's doing so. In Holloway Creek, Alberta, in the autumn of 1891, that woman was Josephine Aldred. She was 28 years old, the daughter of the town's only schoolteacher, and had taken over the position herself when her father's eyes began to fail him 3 years prior. She had her mother's dark hair, which she wore in a practical braid during school hours, and a way of listening to people fully, without the usual half-attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak. That made every conversation feel like the most important one she'd had. She was capable without being hard. She was funny without being sharp. She had the particular competence of a woman who had been trusted with other people's children for 3 years and had never once given their parents reason to doubt that trust. Every eligible man in the county had at some point worked up the particular courage required to speak to Josephine Aldred about something other than the weather or the price of flour. Most of them had done considerably more than work up courage. There had been Sunday afternoon calls, wildflowers left on the schoolhouse steps, invitations to the harvest supper and the Christmas social. A land surveyor from Red Deer had written her a letter so carefully composed that her friend Blythe had read it twice, and declared it the finest piece of writing she'd seen since school. Josephine had declined all of them, not coldly, not unkindly, with the sort of genuine warmth that made the refusal harder to process, because there was no performance of regret to interpret, only the honest reality of it. People had their theories. She was too serious. She was waiting for someone from the city, someone educated, someone who matched her in ways the county couldn't offer. She had decided privately that her life was better without the complication of a husband. None of them were right. The truth was considerably simpler and considerably more inconvenient. It had a name, Calvin Morrow. And he was, by some particular cruelty of circumstance, the only man in Holloway Creek who had never once thought to try. What no one knew, not even Calvin, was that the window Josephine had quietly held open for him was beginning at last to close. Calvin Morrow was 33 years old and ran the feed and supply operation on the east end of Holloway Creek's main road, a business he had inherited from his uncle at 25 and built carefully into something the whole county depended on. He was not the most prosperous man in the district. He was not the most handsome, though the description was not unfair. He was tall, broad-shouldered from years of physical work, with the kind of quietness that people sometimes mistook for reserve, but was actually something closer to economy. He didn't speak unless he had something worth saying, and when he did, people listened. What Calvin Morrow was, without argument, was reliable, not in the dull sense, in the deep sense. He showed up, he remembered. When the Whitmore family lost their barn to fire in the spring of 1890, Calvin had organized the lumber, the labor, and the food for the builders without being asked and without announcing it afterward. When old Reverend Spence needed someone to drive him to Lacombe every third Thursday for his medical appointments, Calvin simply began doing it and continued doing it for 2 years. He was the kind of man a community builds itself around without fully noticing it has done so. He and Josephine had known each other since childhood. They had grown up attending the same small church, the same community suppers, the same harvest dances. They had the easy, unexamined familiarity of two people who have always simply been part of each other's landscape, present in the way a creek is present, or a stand of birch trees on the North Hill. You notice them when they're gone, you stop noticing them when they're simply there. He came into the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon in September to drop off a load of firewood for the winter, and found her at the front of the room, erasing the day's arithmetic from the blackboard, the last students gone, her braid coming slightly loose on one side from a long day's work. "Afternoon, Joe," he said. the way he'd said it 100 times. "Calvin," she said, without turning, the way she'd answered 100 times. He stacked the wood in the box beside the stove. She finished erasing the board. He left. Outside on the road, his neighbor Pete Duggan, who had been refused by Josephine 2 summers ago and had arrived at a philosophy of peaceful acceptance about it, watched Calvin climb back onto the wagon and shook his head. "You know," Pete said, "for a man with good eyes, you are remarkably blind." Calvin looked at him with genuine puzzlement. "What does that mean?" Pete looked at the sky. "Nothing," he said. "Never mind." But Pete was thinking about something Calvin didn't know yet. That Charles Vautier, the new land agent who had come up from Calgary in the spring, prosperous, educated, recently widowed, and possessed of the polished manners that come from years in a city, had been asking quiet, deliberate questions about Josephine Aldred for the past 3 weeks. The kind of questions a man asks before he makes a serious proposal. The Holloway Creek Harvest Social was held in the community hall on the last Saturday of September, when the leaves had gone gold and the air carried the first serious cold of the coming winter. Josephine went because her students' families would be there, and it was part of her role, because the committee had asked her to help organize the music, and because her landlady had pressed her dress, and it would have been ungrateful not to wear it. She wore it. Deep blue wool fitted at the waist, with the composed pleasantness of a woman who has learned to be present in the places that call for her presence, whether or not she particularly wants to be there. The invitations to dance came almost immediately. She accepted several, because declining without reason would have been conspicuous, and Josephine Aldred did not create unnecessary difficulties. She moved through the evening with the genuine attentiveness she brought to everything. Charles Vautier arrived an hour after the music began. He was 41, well-dressed for the occasion, with the assured ease of a man who has spent years navigating rooms more formal than this one. He was not unkind. He was not unpleasant. He crossed to where Josephine stood near the refreshment table and asked if she would dance. She said yes, because refusing would have required an explanation she didn't have ready, and because she was, above everything, fair. He was an excellent dancer. He was also, she noticed, watching her with the careful, measuring attention of a man who has already made a preliminary decision and is now in the process of confirming it. He asked her thoughtful questions. He listened to her answers. He was, by every observable standard, exactly the sort of man a woman in her position ought to consider seriously. She was trying to. Across the hall, Calvin arrived late from a delivery that had run long, hat still slightly damp from the ride, and accepted a cup of coffee from the table near the door, and leaned against the wall in the way of a man perfectly comfortable attending a social as a spectator. He saw Josephine on the floor with Vautier. Noted, distantly, that Vautier was a smooth dancer, noticed that Josephine was being polite in the particular precise way she was polite when she was paying close attention to something she was still deciding about. She caught his eye across the room, smiled. Not the careful public smile she had been distributing all evening, but the other one, the quick, honest, slightly exasperated one she kept for people she didn't have to perform for. There and gone in a moment. He smiled back. Then Art Kemper appeared at his shoulder wanting to discuss a feed order, and Calvin turned his attention there with the easy obliviousness of a man who has no idea what he just missed. Josephine watched him turn away. Then she looked back at Charles Vautier, who was still watching her with that same deliberate, evaluating attention, and she felt for the first time the cold, specific weight of the possibility that waiting might cost her something she could not get back. 2 days after the social, Josephine's father, Leonard Aldred, sat in his chair by the kitchen window while she washed up after supper and said without preamble, "Charles Vautier came to see me this morning." Josephine kept washing. "He didn't ask about the school," Leonard continued. "He asked about you, whether you were settled here, whether you had any particular understanding with anyone, the kind of questions." He paused. "The kind of questions a man asks before he makes a formal call." Her hands slowed on the plate she was holding. He's a serious man, Leonard said carefully. Steady income, good standing. He's been in the district long enough to know it's not the city. He seems to like it. Josephine set the plate down, dried her hands on the towel, looked out the window at the dark yard. Papa, she said, do you know why I've said no to everyone who's asked? I have a suspicion, Leonard said. It involves Calvin Morrow. It does. She was quiet for a moment. He doesn't see it. I've been patient for 2 years, longer if I'm honest, and he looks at me the way he looks at the Rockies when you can see them on a clear day, like something remarkable that he has never once considered walking toward. Leonard was quiet. Vautier is a reasonable man, Josephine said. If Calvin doesn't, she stopped, started again. He should have said something by now. 2 years is long enough to notice a person. How long will you wait? Her father asked, gently. She looked out at the dark, at the mountains you could sometimes see from this window on very clear mornings. Not much longer, she said, and for the first time she meant it the way it needed to be meant. It was Blythe Pender who told Calvin. Blythe Pender had been Josephine's closest friend since they were 12 years old, and she was the kind of woman who had arrived, after years of watching people complicate things unnecessarily, at a firm belief in saying things plainly. She came into Calvin's shop on a Monday morning, ostensibly to pick up an order of salt blocks, and stood at the counter while he found the paperwork, and said, without looking up from adjusting her gloves, Charles Vautier is going to make a formal call on Josephine before the end of October. Calvin looked up. I'm telling you, Blythe said, because Josephine would never tell you herself, and because you are, and I say this with the full affection of someone who thinks well of you, the most self-unaware man in the province of Alberta. Calvin set down the paperwork. What are you talking about? Blythe looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who has been waiting for a long time to say something. Calvin, she said, Josephine Aldred has turned down every man who has asked her in the last 4 years. There is a reason for that. The reason runs a feed store on the east side of town and is currently looking at me like I'm speaking a foreign language. The shop was quiet. Somewhere on the street a horse shifted and a wagon creaked. Calvin looked at Blythe for a long moment. She wouldn't, he started. She has, Blythe said simply. She has been, for years, and she has been patient about it the way Joe is patient about things, thoroughly and without complaining. But Vautier is serious, and she is at the point where she cannot keep asking herself to wait for someone who doesn't know she's waiting. She picked up her order. I've said what I came to say, she said. The rest is yours. She left. Calvin stood in his shop for a long time after. The familiar smell of grain and rope and dry timber, a beam of October light crossing the floor, the specific stillness of a man whose understanding of something he thought he knew has just quietly, completely rearranged itself. Josephine Aldred. 4 years, Vautier, October. He set down the invoice he was still holding. He had the distinct, unsettling sense of a man who has been standing next to something extraordinary for so long that he stopped registering it as extraordinary, and has just, in the space of 3 minutes, been made to see it again. He did not sleep well that night. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon 4 days later. Josephine was walking back from the post office, letters in hand, taking the long way because the air was sharp. And the aspen leaves were gold, and she always took the long way when she needed to think. She passed Calvin's shop. He was out front, adjusting the wheel on a delivery cart, coat off despite the cold, hat pushed back. She stopped, because she always stopped, because even 10 minutes in his company had always been, for reasons she had long since stopped analyzing, better than none. Afternoon, she said. Joe. He straightened. Looked at her in the way he occasionally did when he forgot to keep it casual. That look she had catalogued so carefully over so many years, the one she had convinced herself meant nothing because it was safer to believe that. There was a pause, not the comfortable, ordinary kind, something else in it. He set down the wrench he'd been holding. I heard about Vautier, he said. She went still. I know I have no standing to say anything about it. His voice was level, deliberate, the way he talked when he was choosing every word. I understand that. I've had no standing for a while now because I've had no business staying quiet for as long as I have. He looked at his hands, then back at her. But I need to say something before you make any kind of decision. And I need you to know that if I say it badly, it's not because I don't mean it. The street was quiet. A crow called somewhere in the poplars down the lane. She waited. "I love you," he said, simply, without preamble. "I think I have for longer than I knew how to recognize, and I should have said it before now. I know that. I convinced myself it was unlikely, that you couldn't possibly, and I was wrong about that, I think. I was wrong." He looked at her directly. "I couldn't let Vaudier make his call without you knowing that somebody sees you, that I see you. I've always seen you. I just didn't know until recently that seeing someone and saying so are two different things, and that the second one matters." The air between them was very still. Josephine looked at him for a long moment. The October light was the particular gold of late afternoon in Alberta, the kind that makes everything look like a painting of itself. Then she took one step closer and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "Calvin, I have been holding this for 3 years waiting for you to catch up. I was starting to think I'd have to leave the door open for another 3 before you'd notice it." She held his gaze. "Don't make me wait any longer," she said. "I'm asking you not to." And Calvin Morrow, who had spent 33 years looking at something remarkable and calling it ordinary, finally knew what he was looking at. Before we go on, I want to know where you're listening from today. Drop it in the comments, wherever you are in this country or beyond it. It means more than you might think to know where this story is finding you. Now, let's go back, because Calvin still has some things to do. He went to see Leonard Aldred the following morning. He had dressed with care, not self-consciously. Calvin was not a self-conscious man, but with the specific attention of someone who understands that some moments deserve to be taken seriously. He knocked on the door of the Aldred house at 9 o'clock, hat in hand. Leonard answered, looked at Calvin, looked at the hat, said nothing, and stepped back to let him in. They sat in the front room. Calvin said, plainly, what he had come to say, that he intended to call on Josephine properly, that he understood he had taken longer than a reasonable man should have to arrive at this point, and that he was asking permission to proceed. Leonard was quiet for a moment after Calvin finished. Then he looked out the window at the yard. "You took your time," Leonard said. "Yes, sir," Calvin said. "I did. I expect you'll make up for it." "I intend to." Leonard nodded once. "You have my blessing," he said. "Go tell her yourself." Josephine was at the schoolhouse. Saturday, no students, but she used her Saturdays to prepare the coming week. She was at her desk when the knock came at the door, and Calvin stepped in, hat still in his hands from the conversation with her father, and stood in the doorway of the room where she had taught 3 years of other people's children, and said, "I'd like to court you." Properly. Starting today, she looked at him from across the room. Something in her chest that had been held very carefully in place for a long time quietly let go. "You know," she said, "most men who come calling manage to bring something." He looked at his empty hands. "I'll bring something tomorrow." "Is there going to be a tomorrow?" "Everyone I have," he said, "for as long as you'll have me." She looked at him for one moment more, and then she smiled. The real one, the unguarded one, the one she'd been giving him pieces of for years without either of them naming it. "Then you'd better not be late," she said. What followed was the most thoroughly discussed courtship in Holloway Creek's recent memory. He brought things. Not elaborate things. He was not an elaborate man, but specific ones. A jar of preserves from the Mennonite farm south of town, because she'd mentioned once 2 years ago that their Saskatoon jam was the best she'd ever had. A book from the traveling library in Lacombe that he'd tracked down because she'd said, offhandedly, that she'd been looking for it. Small, exact things that told her what she had always known. He had been listening. He had always been listening. He just hadn't known until recently what to do with what he heard. He came to Thursday supper at the Aldreds. Leonard was warm in the careful way of a father who is relieved without wanting to appear it. They sat around the table and talked with the ease of people who have known each other most of their lives, except that now neither of them was pretending the ease was merely neighborly. On a Sunday in October, they drove out to the ridge above the valley, where you could see the whole of the land spread below. The creek, the town, the long, flat fields running toward the horizon, and behind everything, on a clear day, the first suggestion of mountains. They sat on the bench of the wagon in the cold afternoon air and talked the way people talk when they've stopped performing. "Why me?" he asked, and he meant it as a genuine question, not as false modesty. "You could have had your pick, because you were the same every time," she said. "Every man who came around was showing me something, his land, his prospects, his good intentions. You never showed me anything, you just showed up." She looked out at the valley. "I always knew exactly what I was getting. That's rarer than people make it sound." He was quiet for a while. "Then Vautier is a decent man." "He is. You could have. Calvin." She turned to look at him directly. "I waited for you, not because I had no other option, because you were the option I wanted. Don't make me explain that twice." He looked at her, at this woman who had held something quietly and steadily for years and had offered it to him without conditions when the moment finally came. He felt the specific, clear-eyed gratitude of a man who understands exactly what almost didn't happen. The valley was cold and gold below them. The sky was the pale blue of a late Alberta afternoon, and something that had been patient for a very long time sat down beside him on that wagon bench and stopped needing to be patient. He asked her in November, on the evening of the first real snowfall, on the steps of the schoolhouse after the remembrance social. He had his grandmother's ring in his coat pocket, a simple gold band with a small inset stone, cleaned carefully and carried for 3 weeks. While he waited for a moment that felt honest rather than staged, she had come out ahead of him, while the hall was still warm and full behind them, needing a moment of cold air. He followed. Snow was falling lightly, the kind that sticks, covering the road and the steps and the bare branches of the elm trees along the walk in a soft, indifferent white. He stopped beside her. "Joe," he said, "I need to say this plainly because I have not always said things plainly enough, and you deserve better than that." She turned to look at him, snow in her hair. "I love you," he said. "I have for a long time, which I know is not a point in my favor, and I understand that. But I know it now the way I know the things I'm most certain of, and I would very much like you to be my wife." He paused. "If you're willing to take on a man who needed a long time to see what was in front of him, and who intends, now that he sees it, not to miss another day of it." Josephine looked at him. The snow came down quietly. "Calvin Morrow," she said, "that is the least romantic proposal in the history of this province." "I know," he said. "I'm aware. You could have said half of that, and it would have been twice as poetic. Also aware." A pause, the snow, the quiet street. "Yes," she said, simply. Finally, after all of it, after the years of patience, the careful hoping, the long winter of waiting for him to catch up, the word that had always been there, ready. Yes. He put the ring on her finger on the schoolhouse steps in the November snow, and she looked at it the way you look at something you already know. They were married in February, in the church where they had both been baptized, in the town where both of them had grown up, and where both of them intended to stay. The pews were full. Half of Holloway Creek felt, with reasonable justification, that they had been personally invested in this outcome for years, and had therefore earned their attendance. Blythe Pender, in the second row, was visibly, unapologetically pleased with herself. Josephine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered at the waist, with her hair done properly, and a spray of dried wildflowers because fresh ones were impossible in February in Alberta, and she had never been the sort of woman who required the impossible when the real thing would do. She walked toward Calvin with the quiet certainty of a woman arriving somewhere she had always been heading. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come and understood, with sudden, complete clarity, how close he had come to missing this entirely. How a man could stand next to something extraordinary for years and fail to name it. How Vautier had very nearly made his formal call, how one more week of his own obliviousness might have changed the whole shape of his life. He was not going to waste a day of what came next. They said their vows plainly. Every word was true. The years that followed were good ones, built from work and steadiness and the comfort of two people who genuinely liked each other and who had, by the time they married, no illusions left to maintain. The feed business grew. Josephine kept teaching. The school board had made clear they did not want to lose her, and Calvin had made equally clear that what she chose to do with her work was her own decision, which she had filed away as further evidence that she had been right about him. She was quick with the accounts and quietly appalled by his pricing, which she corrected in the first year with the practical efficiency of a woman who had grown up watching her father undervalue his own labor. He didn't argue. He had learned quickly that on certain matters, numbers, sense, and the appropriate way to respond when someone is correct. Josephine was simply right. Their daughter arrived in the second year. They named her Marin for Calvin's mother, a quiet, watchful child with her father's patience and her mother's precise dark eyes. Their son came in the fourth year. They named him Edmund for Leonard Aldred, who had been waiting for the honor with the dignified restraint of a man trying not to make it obvious how much he was hoping for it. On a summer evening in their seventh year, Josephine was out behind the house, cutting the last of the kitchen garden before the first frost, sleeves rolled up, hair in its practical braid, humming, something she'd taught her students that year. Calvin came through the gate from the street, still in his work coat, and stopped. He watched her for a moment before she noticed him. The Alberta evening light in late August does a particular thing. It turns everything gold, and still in a way that makes the ordinary look lit from within. The garden, the fence. Her hands moving through the bean plants, she looked up, saw him standing at the gate. "You're staring," she said. "I know. You didn't used to stare." "I didn't used to know what I was looking at," he said. "I've corrected that." She smiled at him. The real one. He came through the gate and crossed the garden and took the basket from her hands and set it down and held her in the evening light. She rested her head against his chest. From inside the house came the voices of Marin and Edmund, disagreeing about something with the complete conviction of children who have inherited stubbornness from both sides of the family. Calvin held his wife in the late August light and thought about Blythe Pender standing at his counter in October, about the invoice he'd set down, about Vautier, about how different the shape of this evening might have looked if he'd taken one more week to understand what he was looking at. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I see you," he said quietly. She didn't ask what he meant. She knew. She had always known. She'd been waiting for him to learn to say it. Years later, when Marin was old enough to ask, she asked. They were in the kitchen, Josephine teaching Marin to make the butter tarts that had become a fixed point of every family occasion, the question arriving sideways in the middle of something else entirely, the way the real questions always do. "How did you know Papa was the one?" Marin asked. "Before he knew it himself." Josephine worked the pastry for a moment without answering. "He never performed anything," she said finally. "Every man who came around was presenting something. His land, his prospects, his good character, his intentions. Your father just showed up the same way every time." A pause. "I always knew who he was. That's harder to find than people think." Marin considered this. "But you almost didn't wait because of Mr. Vautier." Josephine looked at her daughter, Calvin's patience in her face and her own eyes. "Yes," she said honestly. "Almost." She handed Marin the rolling pin. "That's the part I want you to remember. Not the happy ending. The almost." She looked at her daughter steadily. "Know what you want. Don't perform for anyone. Not to get their attention, not to keep it. And if the person you're waiting for is slow to see you, give them time, but not forever." A pause. "At some point you say the true thing. You give them the chance to show up." "What if they don't?" Marin asked. Josephine was quiet for a moment. "Then you know," she said, "and you move forward and you build your life out of something real." She covered her daughter's hands with hers on the rolling pin. "But Marin, in my experience, when you say the true thing to the right person," she smiled. they show up. Josephine Aldred did not wait passively. That is worth saying plainly. She lived her life fully during those years. She taught, she read, she made herself indispensable to a community of children who needed someone to believe they were capable. She showed up every day as exactly herself, without adjusting herself to be more approachable to anyone in particular. And when the moment came, when she understood that patience had a limit and that Vautier was real, and the clock was no longer a distant abstraction, she said the true thing on a cold October street and walked away without waiting to see how it landed. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Calvin is not a villain in this story. He is something more recognizable. A man so genuinely convinced that something wonderful was out of reach that he never reached. A man who needed in the end not to be told that love exists. He already knew that. But to understand that love, like a garden, does not maintain itself while you're standing at the gate, deciding whether to go in, they chose each other. Deliberately. At the last reasonable moment, but still in time. That's the part that matters. That's the part worth holding. Thank you for listening today, wherever you are. In this country, or somewhere the Canadian winter has never reached, I'm grateful you were here. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.